Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us online this afternoon, and a particular welcome to our guests, Robert Harriman and Aidan McGarry, whom we will be introducing to you later on. And of course, a especially warm welcome to all those who contributed to the book and that we have the pleasure of launching today. So to give you a sense of what lies ahead, Thomas Smits and myself and Rigney we're first going to say something about the book, and then we're going to introduce the commentators, and then we'll move on to a general response from all of those who would like to join in and talk about the book or about the comments on it. So here you see a copy of the book, The Visual Memory of Protest. I have actually got the first real copy of the book. It was a bit delayed because of Brexit customs problems, but it does actually exist. I can assure everybody I can hold it in my hand. But of course, it's also available, and we're very excited about. It's also available open access, so you can simply download an entire PDF copy of it for your own use and enjoyment. Be careful that you go to the e-book version on the Amsterdam University Press website, because sometimes you have to look a bit for that. The Visual Memory of Protest book has emerged from a larger project that we've been running here at Utrecht for the last 5 years. We're now into our final year, and the project is called Remembering Activism, the Cultural Memory of Protest in Europe. And we're particularly pleased with the Visual Memory of Protest because it's the first book to come out of this project, but it's the first of a series of 4 different publications. So we've lots to look forward to in the next months. So keep your eyes out for any new announcements. Now, what's the central focus of Remembering Activism? It's about the role played by cultural memory in the history of social movements. And more specifically, how does the publicly available and therefore culturally constructed memory of earlier movements play in the conduct and the reception of later ones? And now in our book, we focus specifically on photography as a cultural carrier of protest memory. In doing so, we engaged in dialogue with ongoing research in the field of social memory studies on the role of visual communication and visuality more generally in social movements. There have been studies of banners, colors, graffiti, logos, symbols, and of course of photography as made by participants and observers of social movements. Now, what our collection does, and it's in line with, of course, our interest in cultural memory, is that we have added in a memory dimension into this whole discussion. So the question is not only how does visuality work in the conduct of protest, but how does the memory of earlier images, especially ones relating to earlier protests, shape what is later seen by photographers, and hence what becomes visible or what remains invisible to people looking on. And here just one example from the book, which we discuss in our introduction, which is an image from the G20 protests in 2017 in Hamburg. And I think you recognize this photograph as reminding you of many other photographs, many other standoff photographs, particularly ones involving women, from Yesha Evans at the Black Lives Matter protest in Baton Rouge in 2016 to more iconic photographs from the 1960s, most notably the famous one of Jan Rose Casimir holding up a flower in front of a phalanx of armed guards. So this you could say this protester is placing herself in a great tradition. The photographer is placing herself in a great tradition. And we could say this familiarity gives extra value to that moment. But at the same time, there's always a suspicion that what we're dealing here with is mere repetition, with cliche, rather than with something which is a real happening, something new which is happening. As we put it in our introduction, there's a dialectic going on between the whole time between the déjà vu, what is already familiar, and the strikingly new. And what we try to investigate is the question of visibility, the coming into appearance of new groups. How is that helped by memory, but also how memory can sometimes also become a cut off, a sense of something really new happening. So we're interested in this dialectic between the déjà vu and the strikingly new, which meant that we were looking for long-term dynamics in the production of photographs. More than the production of photographs, we were interested also in the reproduction of photographs, reproductions of particular photographs, but also of types of photographs. And this is key, we believe, to the question of memorability. Memorability is in reproduction. And with that, I'd like to hand over to my great colleague and fellow editor, Thomas Smits.
Thank you, Anne. And also first from me, as I'm letting some of the last people who are joining us into the room. So thank you also from me to all the contributors to the volume, and also to Anne, my fellow editor. So the book is subdivided into three sections. So the first section, Producing Memorable Images, zooms in on how images of protest events are produced, but also explores the correlation between the aesthetics of these images and their capacity to indeed be memorable. And I'm just going to put on the table of contents here so that you can see the chapters. So in the first chapter, Marco Solaroli investigates the institutional work of the World Press Awards in shaping the visual memory of activism. And he argues that the awards simultaneously shape professional standards and aesthetic stylistic trends, and even to that extent that the iconic power of prize-winning photographs risks tipping protests over into what he calls mere aesthetics. So in the second chapter, Erika Zerves examines the fascinating work of Brazilian photojournalist Nair Benedicto. Benedicto balanced her roles as a visual journalist and an activist in the early 1970s in Brazil. And although it has not been very widely reproduced, she concludes that Benedicto's works provides a visual archive of protests that could serve as a resource for counter-memory in present-day Brazil. So in the final essay of the first section, our colleague Duygu Erbil analyzes the iconic portrait of the Turkish student leader and revolutionary Deniz Geçmiş. And she notes how this image has been reproduced and reappropriated by a wide range of political groups, including during the 2013 Gezi Park occupations. And she also asks why this particular image has proven such a fruitful research for later protesters. So in the second section, reproduction and remediation, the book focuses on the ways in which images circulate in the intervals between protest cycles, so either in their original or in an adaptive form. In the first essay, Antigone Memou examines the visual legacy of May 1968 in France. She argues that the power of visual memory ends up producing a very male-gendered view of the movement, and one that effectively sort of reduces women to mere symbols. Our colleague Clara Flessing examines a mural of activist Sylvia Pankhurst on a wall of a pub in East London. She shows how even in our age of digital abundance, institutional, financial, and also technological constraints continue to shape Pankhurst's visual memory. And in the final essay of this section, Samuel Merrill discusses the online circulation of The Woman with a Handbag, an iconic photo from 1985 that shows a woman striking a neo-Nazi with her handbag during a rally in Sweden. He shows how the algorithms behind search engines, such as Google, places images of protest into visual constellations that cross over between different mnemonic contexts. So the last section of the book, Mobilizing Visual Memory, focuses on the way that visual memory is activated by protesters in an overt manner through the display of historical images during protests. So in the first chapter, Alice Montoni and Anvesha Chakraborty examine how visual memory operated in the India Against Corruption movement in 2011 and 2012. And they argue that the overt evocations of the memory of Mahatma Gandhi helped to align the anti-corruption movement on a symbolical level with a nationally recognized tradition of resistance to power. In the second essay, Sophie Dauphey explores the display of photo portraits of 43 disappeared students in Mexico justice campaigns. And she explains that the mobilizing power of these images, she explains the mobilizing powers of these images, by their resonance with national and international traditions of protest, but also with their resonance with all sorts of religious iconography. And together with my colleague Ruben Ros, I wrote the final chapter in which we chart the online circulation of the iconic tankman photograph. Based on a sort of a large-scale computational analysis, we show how Hong Kong has in fact provided an online space where differences between Western and Chinese interpretations of the image become apparent, and where it has been a constant part of successive waves of mobilization. So that were all the chapters, which we hope you will all have time to read sometime in the future. And now I will introduce our esteemed speakers for today's events. So Professor Robert Harriman and Professor Ada McGarry. Robert Harriman will start. Professor Robert Harriman is a leading scholar in the field of public culture, the history of rhetoric, and maybe most pressing for our book and for today, the role of photography in liberal democratic societies. I think that many of you, maybe most of you, will know him for a seminal book, No Caption Needed, which he co-edited with John Lukaitis, as well as for the many articles and essays on iconic images. His latest book, The Public Image, reveals how photographs can inform, challenge, and help us to reflect upon endemic violence, environmental degradation, income inequality, and lots of other societal ills. So I will give the floor to Professor Harriman.
Thank you, Thomas and Ann. I'm very happy to be here. And we are at a book launch, so I'm expected to say something nice about the book. Fortunately, that is very easy to do. It's a fine book, and one that has a clear and compelling purpose and stays close to that objective from start to finish. The book has three converging foci. The first is memory of activism, the second is memory in activism, and the third is memory activism, where activism is itself directed towards changing collective memory and the priorities in public communication. Now, of course, these orientations can overlap, but the distinction is useful in analyzing and evaluating social movements, and especially the role of media in social movements. It also can be salient in respect to understanding national and perhaps regional differences, as these can involve different cultures of memory. William Faulkner has said that the past is not even past, but in the US, he had to say it. Outside of US public culture, the past can be much more palpable, contested, and dispositive in respect to both the realities and aspirations of the present. And that is why I like another feature of the book, which is that it does not include studies of events or media coverage in the US. Locales range across Europe, Latin America, India, and Hong Kong, along with attention to global circulation. Western influence is still evident in the citations, which reflect the dominant configuration of media studies over the last century. But even there, change is evident, and one can see how valuable it can be to bring different networks of media study together. In any case, the book remains highly legible to anyone in media studies, and it provides a good introduction to the study of visual media for those social movement scholars who have been focused on other dimensions of movement organization or institutional change. The attention to visual media may appear a bit retro, as it focuses primarily on photography and how photographic images are reworked through analog media such as posters, banners, and murals. Don't look here for studies of discorrelated images, glitch cultures, interface effects, or other digital media aesthetics. This division of labor makes a lot of sense, however, or at least it makes sense in respect to the boots on the ground pragmatics of social movements and what continue to be crucial media practices for their success. Obviously, I'm biased here, but we shouldn't get sidetracked by a traditional versus new media debate. All media are intertwined now in both practice and inquiry. The research has made clear that photography continues to be a major factor in the coverage of protests, in the media used in protests, and in respect to long phase effects such as the impact on collective memory. And it does so because of how easily it moves through digital technologies. What is especially important now and in this volume is an emphasis on how photography is remediated and reworked into other media. As a personal note, this transition from a primary focus on the original image as it is circulated in its original media domain to becoming a template for production and circulation in other media was exactly what defined the development of No Caption Needed. John Lucchese and I started with the first assumption, but the internet was growing fast as we worked on the book. As a result, we stumbled into a second focus on what we labeled appropriations of the iconic image across other media, genres, and topics. And we came to see that as the key to understanding icons as a genre of public culture. Now, however, it is clear that appropriations are necessary to understand photography, tout court, and that they are central to many digital media practices and to social movement protests. Throughout the visual memory of protest, the authors seamlessly track how images are pulled across media, and especially the media of the street, such as handbills, posters, graffiti, and clothing. And they do so without undue anxiety about 20th century problems of representation and authenticity. Hybridity without loss of identity is the new normal, and good thing too. This relative lack of anxiety about the purity and danger of visual representation brings me to three themes that I want to offer as a means for working with the book. The first is that the book is a good example of the paradigm shift in the critical discourse on photography that John Lucchese and I promoted in our 2016 book, The Public Image. The shift was from the critical discourse developed by Alan Sekula, John Tagg, and many others, and disseminated globally by Susan Sontag's On Photography. The discourse was a major intellectual accomplishment, not least as it pushed photography to the center of debates about modernity. But it also contained serious problems from the start and promoted comprehensive misrecognitions of photography as a medium and photojournalism as it is a democratic public art. I won't rehearse them today, but these issues became more evident with the development of digital technologies, and many artists and scholars are moving on, even, however, as they may unconsciously recur to the older discourse to explain, poorly, why media matter. The visual memory of protest provides good examples of how the new paradigm works, that is, as a practice that continues to draw on the older critical vocabulary, but also draws on more productive assumptions about media activism and civic spectatorship, and is oriented to doing more than issuing oft-repeated warnings about the cognitive, moral, cultural, and political effects of media domination. The older discourse wasn't entirely wrong, of course, and so those distinctions and concerns need to be taken up when framing one's research. The studies in this volume do so cogently, but as I said, they do more as well. Perhaps the normative and aesthetic alignment with social movements helps, but the scholarship doesn't have to be limited to protests. These studies of protest media are good media studies. That said, I worry a bit about backsliding regarding what is said about iconic photographs. For example, the argument by Sandrine Boudana, Paul Frosch, and Akiba Cohen that icons can be revived to death gets a lot of play across the volume. Thus, we are told, quoting Boudana, the more an iconic photo is circulated, the more it is recognized, as iconic, yet the more it may become devoid of the significance when it is made iconic in the first place. Now, I think highly of the article and its authors, and I believe that the group at Hebrew University and elsewhere in Israel are doing some of the very best work on iconic photographs. But in this case, icons are being put in the position of having to bear what John and I, repurposing John Tagg, labeled the burden of representation, the habit of attributing to one medium what are problems in all media. Can iconic photos become cliches? Sure, just as notable words become cliches without disabling the Bible, Shakespeare, or language. Perhaps I'm being touchy, but one of the affordances of icons is that they provide convenient foils. Even so, the larger point holds. The volume doesn't expend a lot of energy on standard critiques of media, and instead departs from those starting points to develop new and currently more useful distinctions. Thus, icon and iconic appear several hundred times in the book, and we learn of many ways in which iconic images are being remediated and repurposed, and of the diverse relationships between icons and remediation, iconicity and virality, and other features of collective memory. The second and third themes each are examples of how the paradigm shift in the discourse of photography can be extended. Extended not in clearly legible or predictable ways, but as examples of developing new problems and new concepts. Thus, a dialectical pairing of scarcity and abundance runs as a thread through the volume, sometimes using those two terms. On the one hand, there is pushback by several authors against the idea that digital media have brought in an age of image abundance, and renewed consideration of how memory and images, such as, say, award-winning images, depend on conditions of scarcity. On the other hand, the volume as a whole is a demonstration of the affordances of image abundance and the plenitude and innovations in image making that characterize activist movements, and how the dialectic doesn't align neatly with the distinction between analog and digital media. Again, to take an argument from the public image, the dreaded excess of the image world was a staple of the older discourse on photography. But recoding excess as abundance is one feature of the paradigm shift. And the new term allows additional thinking about media. It doesn't wish away the persistent and painful scarcities that continue to define the world, but it does provide a basis for challenging regimes of artificial scarcity. The third and final theme I will mention is that the volume hints at the value of formalist methods in media studies. Now, hints may be an overstatement, and formalism is certainly more my interest than the author's, but consider this statement as illustrative. This collection claims that struggles over the visual definition of events and for control of the public narrative in the short term in the form of news, and in the long term in the form of cultural memory, is part of contention itself and not merely a byproduct. The use of form here obviously is conventional rather than being featured, but it also provides a subtext for the passage and many like it throughout the volume. The study of visual memory becomes a study in pattern recognition, whether on the street or through data analytics, and of how formal features of an image work across media and across time in both media artistry and audience uptake, and of how changes in media and memory can involve or require changes in cultural forms. Equally important, various chapters in the volume demonstrate how formalism need not be apolitical. The most obvious example is the use of silhouettes in Latin American social movements, but the several examples of images becoming or imitating templates apply just as well. The editors get close to the issue when they state the formal and effective echoes, I'll say that again, the formal and effective echoes between new images and historical ones serve to link one protest cycle to another through a specifically visual form of resonance. Now, a lot is packed into that sentence. Two major modalities of mediation, how they combine to link past and present, how the connection between images and between images and audiences is a difficult to grasp phenomenon identified through the synesthesia of visual resonance. Now, curiously, this concept of resonance is one that comes up a lot in literatures on form, and 17 times in this volume. It bears some development, and visual memory might be just the place for exploring it further. Or so it seems to me. Again, this is a fine volume. It demonstrates how photography is remediated and reworked across different media, within and across national cultures, to productively advance both social movement protests and the always endangered resources of collective memory. Visual media proved to be highly accessible, plastic, and effective as means for social movement protests. And social movements are shown to be important nodal points for collective memory and cultural change because of how and how well they use visual media. These contributions come from outside the US and are all the more valuable for that. Because they are grounded in a coherent research domain, they can be used productively in comparisons with many other movements in media studies. Because they unconsciously reflect a paradigm shift in the discourse on photography, they provide examples of how that works and of the work remaining to be done. So let me close by offering my congratulations to the editors, the authors, and the press. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Harriman. That was great and a lot to think about already. But we will first move on to our second speaker, which is Ada McGarry, who is a professor of international politics and associate dean for research at Loughborough University in London. And next to his research on the political voice of minority and marginalized communities, he works on the intersection between social movements and visual culture. And his latest book in this era, The Aesthetics of Global Protest, Visual Culture and Communication, was published in 2019 in the same series as our own volume at the Amsterdam University Press. Aidan, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a great honor to be here and to offer an introduction to this excellent book, The Visual Memory of Protest by Rigney and Smits. I was lucky enough to participate in a small workshop at the very beginning of this REACT project. So it's wonderful to see the fruits of your labors. So the book itself, it looks to the past, but is very much grounded in the present as we attempt to understand socio-political and cultural action regarding protest movements. And this includes their legacy, their power, their meaning in terms of civic engagement and democracy, as well as their role vis-a-vis collective identity, communication, and commemoration. The book shows that images document and bear witness. They confront us with what is hidden or what is ignored, and they also hold a mirror up and force us to reckon with our past, our present, and our future. Photographs themselves can evoke emotions. They can pull us into a given time and place. They can speak to our innate humanity, shape our collective understandings and memories, as well as, importantly, galvanize us to action. So it informs how we think about people, ideas, events, and phenomena. And this book, I think, captures this complexity at work. Now, before I get into discussing the book's arguments and contributions, I'd like to start with an anecdote, if I may. A few years ago, I ran a project which looked at protest aesthetics during the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul in 2013. As part of the project, I wanted to organize an event, an exhibition, which would showcase various protest aesthetics and iconic imagery and visual culture from the protests. If you remember at Gezi Park, there was this incredible explosion of artistic and creative expression around the protests. Now, some of this visual culture included the woman in red photograph or the standing man, as well as penguins. Now, the reason that penguins were so ubiquitous during Gezi Park was because during the height of the protests, CNN Turkey, rather than covering the events in the streets, Istanbul was in revolt, it was on fire, CNN Turkey transmitted a documentary about penguins instead. So the next day, protesters came to the park dressed as penguins, saying, maybe now the media will pay attention to us. Penguins were then appropriated and remediated in different ways, including in stencils and graffiti, especially one wearing a gas mask. A few years after the protests, I went to Istanbul. I met with an artist and creator to discuss what this exhibition might look like. We walked around the city and we would see stencils of penguin or the woman in red dress written into the materiality of the city. We saw people wearing t-shirts with slogans and images from the protests. And we at one point went to a cafe and the waiter serving us our coffees had a large penguin tattoo on his arm. So we laughed because we realized that the idea for having an exhibition showcasing protest aesthetics was not a very good one. It was already living on through cultural memory on the walls and pavements and actually etched permanently into some people's bodies. The visual memory of the protest was all around Istanbul with murals, slogans, t-shirts, as well as how it was remembered and celebrated in artistic practices. So the memory of the protest was so vivid and the people of Istanbul displayed and communicated their political allegiances through visual culture of the protest. And so it needed time to settle, but its significance was all too apparent even then. Now, I mentioned this anecdote because it highlights some of the key themes of the book: visual culture and activism, remediation, iconography, cultural work and memory, and the memory of protest. So now on to this great book. The book itself is notable because of its conceptual coherence. Anyone who has worked on an edited volume will know that this is one of the great challenges. So, it's a challenge because with different disciplinary perspectives, as well as empirical cases, methods, and so on, trying to find a coherent vision is difficult. So my congratulations to Ann and Thomas for providing a robust conceptual framework, and to the contributors for speaking to these core themes. It does feel very unified. The book tackles an important topic, the role of visual memory in protest. It explores the interplay between visibility and visual memory. And ultimately, it seeks to show how meaning is made and also how meaning changes through visual culture and media practices. Protests themselves are dynamic moments of collective effervescence, and visual culture attempts to capture and distill a moment in time for signification. At the same time, the volume shows that visual culture is itself a site of contestation. It is never quite fixed, it is socially constructed, and its meaning is up for grabs. I'm not quite sure if there is more protest today than at previous times, although it does feel that way. It feels that we're in a state of flux, lurching from one socioeconomic, health, political, and ecological crisis to the next. And so protests and social movements are a way to be seen and to be heard, to realize individual as well as collective agency, and to assert some sort of control. It reminds us that we are political animals. But protest movements have always learned from the past. They build on what was there before, how we engage in protest, for example. And I think the book really speaks to one of the most dominant concepts in social movement studies, which is Chuck Tilley's repertoires of contention. It suggests how action repertoires, which is what protesters do, is as much cultural memory as strategy or tactic. There is a reason why demonstrations, occupations, confronting authorities, and so on persist. They work by and large. Protests themselves do not arise in a vacuum. They build on previous mobilizations, successes, and failures. And protest movements have long latent periods. And this is where much cultural identity work is done. So visual culture and imagery help to anchor the concerns and demands of the present to a past. And this demonstrates legacy, legitimacy, and purpose, that we are part of something bigger, even as we seek to change the status quo. I did enjoy how the book embeds the issue of iconicity into a broader discussion of reproduction and considers images that are popular but not necessarily iconic. And I think it is important to kind of destabilize and shift the gaze away from hegemonic imagery to explore other manifestations of protest. I found the chapter by Zolaroli, Exploring the World Press Photos, illuminating, as news media has set the tone for visual tropes, motifs, and practices. For example, protesters challenging the police or army. And this creates new expectations about how we think about protest. I also welcome the chapter by Memu on the Paris 1968 uprisings, because it shed light on what images are missing from protest aesthetics. You know, why are we only seeing young men in these images? And what does this reveal about journalistic and media practices and biases, as well as what gender norms are reinforced as a result of the circulation of these images? This point is also discussed by Zerwes in her chapter on the memory of protest in Brazil. And this also raises questions about what we consider to be protest action. Our eyes are often drawn to the dramatic and the carnivalesque, but we miss about 90% of social movement activity, much of which is rather boring and humdrum, as anyone who is engaged in sustained activism will attest. There are many meetings, communication with members, fundraisings, and so on, but this often happens behind closed doors, and there are often no photographers there. So we only tend to see the outward-facing activities. And so there is the potential that we miss this story by fixing a symbol of protest as an individual or as one image. And we should be careful about the hegemonic power of images and what they mean. Ubiquity can blunt some of the revolutionary zeal of some of these iconic visual images. So these chapters, which prodded our understanding of protest, highlight a strange paradox. The nature of protest is to be radical, but much protest imagery, certainly through, say, Getty images or Google searches and other archives, follow certain norms and standards in terms of theme and composition, but they're capturing this ultimate disruption to the status quo, civil disobedience, and the realization of democratic expression and agency. But photographs themselves tend to be captured by rule followers as they capture rule breakers, which I think is a really interesting insight. Several of the chapters point to remediation and how images and visual culture can be reanimated to create new meanings deployed by activists for strategic reasons. The chapter by Merrill and Blessing are useful are instructive on this point. The chapter on India by Matoni and Chakrabarti look at how the symbol of Gandhi was harnessed during the anti-corruption mobilization in 2011, which reveals that visuals themselves blur the boundary between the past and the present, developing a narrative in which different times of protests live side by side. I appreciated how the book raises questions about history and legacy, raised cultural memory, the chapter by Erbil, what holds, what remains, what continues to resonate with activists, media, journalists, the public, politicians, and also why. And the chapter by Dufay shows how cultural memory works for different activist groups concerning the disappeared in Mexico. So there is this potential for images to ascribe and or fix a public meaning or understanding of a particular event. So activists resignify the past to fulfill certain requirements of the present, often in strategic ways. The chapter by Smits and Ross shows the most famous protest photograph in the world, probably, the Tank Man, has very different meanings in different contexts, whether that's in China, where the image almost doesn't exist, in Hong Kong, where it is a symbol of resistance, and also globally, where it's a cipher for human rights. So today, protests are highly visible, documented and discussed across media platforms. We can say that we live in a time of image saturation. That means it can be harder for photographs to break through the sheer volume of images and connect with different publics and inspiring further action. There is much research, I think, to be done on this topic. Social movements are about agitating and affecting change, overthrowing a regime, changing a law or policy, or raising awareness of an idea or issue which should be considered important. But the most difficult thing to do is not to change a law or policy, but actually to change attitudes, to change hearts and minds. And it often takes generations for these ideas to flourish and find root in new ground. This volume, I think, really helps us to understand how this is possible, the role of memory and cultural work in protest, and the power of visual culture to inform these understandings and our knowledge. So finally, my congratulations to all the authors on this important open access contribution to humanities and social science research. I'm sure it's going to speak to students, activists, and scholars and offer rich foundations for embarking on future research journeys. Thank you.
And thank you very much also, Aidan, that was wonderful. So maybe we want to first have maybe the respondents want to respond to each other. I will give some, if you want to, you're very welcome to.
Open it up.
Yeah, we're going to open it up, right? Okay, so
Okay.
That means that everybody now, I'm going to try to give you access to your microphones and also cameras. Right. Oh, wait. So oops. Oh, toestaan. Yeah. Right. So I hope that now you're still muted, but you hopefully can unmute yourself. And you can also turn on your camera if you want to, but you don't need to. Hi and welcome. So maybe we can just start with questions, right? Does anybody have a question? Or maybe I can give the floor to Ann if she wants to respond. I don't know. Oh, and you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for these wonderful responses. It's always amazing to see one's own work then through the lens of another perspective. And that's, I guess, the moment of publication, right? When somehow strange eyes start looking at your work. So to hear it from a media studies perspective and from a social movements perspective makes one realize just how, in a sense, how slippery an object the book is as an object, and how many different perspectives it touches on. I loved your phrase, Aidan, about rule followers and depicting rule breakers, and this tension between the sort of the making the things legible and therefore having to call on some sort of repertoire of legibility, at the same time trying to capture something which is in motion. And I guess that is the real challenge of this of the photographer, but also of studying, as it were, this phenomenon, which Robert emphasizes more how we brought out patterns of repetition. I'd like to think that alongside those patterns of repetition, we also made visible these sort of challenges, these movements, these shifts in meaning and shifts in the notion of the visible itself. And again, your comment on how some protests take place invisibly, that they're actually, it's not the work of the streets, but it's behind the scenes. And I felt that Erika Zerwe's study of Nair Benedicto in a way captures a little bit of that sense of the less dramatic moments of protests, which have nevertheless been captured by this very creative photographer. So lots of things, you hear it already. I'm very excited about your response, and look forward to following up on many of these issues with you. But of course, there will be other people here who would like to chip in, and I'm thinking would love to hear from some of the authors, if they recognize themselves in these depictions, or if they would like to add anything.
I see some authors in the list, so you're very welcome to respond. I hope that you can unmute yourself. So I think that should be possible. Right. So if it's not possible, please let me know in the chat. So that, but I don't see anything popping up. So maybe maybe there's no comments just yet. It's always a little bit awkward at first, I guess, on the internet, right? Being online, but maybe this will give me the opportunity to ask a question myself. Is that all right, Ann?
Sure,
can I start?
Please, yeah.
Yeah. So this is a question. It is mainly for my own interest to Professor Herman, because I love that you referenced this article. I think that many people who are interested in iconic images have read by Budana about icons who are sort of left to die on the internet, right? Because they are circulated so much that they indeed become cliches or in fact memes, which sort of destroys or denies their original meaning. And I was wondering, indeed, because I found your comments about the cliches that words, the cliche meanings that words can have, and the Bible and that sort of stuff, and Shakespeare, very revealing in this aspect. But I was wondering, how about the production of icons? Because when you wrote your book, I think the production icons were very much produced within the context of print media and television. So they were very much most of the icons you wrote about, right? So is there still room in the sort of the online space, which indeed can be qualified by its visual abundance, for icons to emerge, right? Is there still room for like this photojournalistic icon, which then becomes a general icon in that sense? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
How's that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I very probably was a reviewer for that article. I can't remember, but I'm very supportive of their work and all that. And the rule can't be we can only say good things about icons. Just as before, the rule was you can only say bad things about them. Well, that's not good either. So, in the critical discourse. But first of all, one thing John and I realized early on is you absolutely can't predict the emergence of an icon. And lots of individuals and organizations try to create icons. They can't figure out how to do it. It's just, and I don't want to make it sound like it's mysterious. It's just complex. And will we have more icons? Who knows? When will they emerge? Who knows? Sometimes you can go decades between icons, and that seems like a long time when you're living it, but it's not, from any sort of historical vantage. So that's the first point. Second point is, everyone thinks they're living in an oversaturated media environment, whether it's 1600 or 2023. And everyone's right. So there has been this continual development of information and media cultures and so forth and so on. So, if you were living in London in 1600, you were awash in posters, pamphlets, all sorts of things. There wasn't nearly enough time in the day to read everything and so forth. So same thing today. And one thing we see is that people become very adept at managing information overload. And anytime you want to, you can point to it and say, oh, that's the cause of something. But I think most of the time it's not. So that's just too simple. And so I really don't worry a lot about that. And I think we're saying that's why instead of just seeing, the image world is excessive, we should consider how it's abundant. And then there are problems of scarcity and there are problems of excess still. But let's recognize that there's an amazing culture here that in fact we're living in and drawing on all the time. Now, when we started writing the book on icons, we thought we were seeing a media form that would become extinct very quickly. It was at the end of a good run within a particular kind of media culture and within a particular form of liberal democracy. What we observed, though, is that the icons are mediated very easily into the new digital environment. And now that doesn't mean they worked in exactly the same way, but and then, of course, the concept of the icon became ridiculously inflated. So in order to create clickbait, you'd have these stories, the 50 most iconic photos of the Obama presidency. Well, that's a contradiction in terms, of course. So we are in a different media environment. Icons now work in conjunction with memes, and they're not the same thing. And so forth. So it's a very complex situation, but I think that iconics particular icons wax and wane, and new ones may emerge. One of the articles, I think, had a very interesting argument, maybe it was yours, Tomas, about reinvesting in icons. So they can become vehicles for all manner of good work. And I don't think that they stay potent all the time, and I don't think they become irrevocably damaged through overuse.
Perhaps I could come in here and ask also Aidan. I maybe also wanted to respond there because you noted the fact that there was interest in images which were not iconic in the sense of the superstars, but popular, and that there was a different sort of power, sort of a circulation of images and according to different lines. And I was very curious if you would want to elaborate on that, particularly in relation to the Turkish example that you gave, but maybe there's another line that you want to follow here too.
Yeah, I mean, during Gizzy, there was a number of images that were circulated. So the research that I did was on social media, particularly on Twitter, and we looked at thousands of different images that were circulated, and there were the iconic images, the one that everyone kind of shared and knew and recognized. And what we didn't anticipate was because people were using technology in a particular way. So they were using their smartphones to take pictures of what they had seen, and then they would upload this to either Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, but mostly it's Facebook and Twitter during Gizzy. And so when we started to code the images, we noticed that there was lots of kind of boring images. They were not exciting. There was no confrontation. There was not large crowds, and people were doing, because there was an occupation for 5 weeks during Gizzy, and so they were, sharing food, or they were having a conversation, or they were gardening, or they were praying, or they were doing exercise. And so we just thought this was, they were doing these rather mundane activities, but all around them, there was a protest, there was a massive, they knew that people were part of an uprising, yet within that they were doing these just everyday kind of, standard activities. And so we started to think about how these images, which were then also circulated and quite popular, or circulated quite widely as well, that they, in a way, they kind of spoke to the kind of society that people wanted to perform. They wanted Turkish society to look like this, to be civil, to be open, to be inclusive, to be, heterogeneous, and non-hierarchical, non-authoritarian, and peaceful. And so these images became very important, even though they didn't kind of fit the mold of what a conventional protest activity is. But my own background is, I grew up in Northern Ireland, and you have these kind of images of kind of political violence and resistance to political violence as well, and they become icons, and people who are involved in those also become iconic because of resistance to British authorities. And so the role of it, I see images and the commemoration, particularly of those in murals and other visual culture in Belfast, plays out in a very different way. There's no like right way or wrong way, but it is just interesting to see the differences and how different media kind of refract those meanings over time.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Right. Thanks. Yeah.
And part of what we need to be doing is identifying the many genres of public culture. So the icon is one genre. The selfie now is another. The body cam is another, so forth. So, there are lots of media forms that are part of the mix. And I don't think you should look at any one of them and say, oh, this is a definitive example of anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But following on that, I think then the question for us in the collection and more generally in the REACT project is also, what stays, right? And I'd be also very curious as those images which were circulated in 2013, if they continue to be circulated in 2016 and are 2023, right? 10 years later, perhaps we're going to get a resurgence given 10 years on of those images being brought back into circulation. So I think what noting these various varieties of types of photographs and the different ways in which photographs and the making of photographs is part of activism itself, as well as the sort of alongside media journalism and that's the question. How will it? What will return in 20 years? And will it be those photographs, or will it be a mode of photography? For example, that mode of the everyday photography. I think that's what we find fascinating in this collection.
I think we just to interject, we had a question by Marco Solaroli. So I don't know if everybody can see that. So I was just going to share it.
Yes,
so
sorry,
Marco,
Marco,
please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
We can hear you. It's not see yet, but that's yeah. Now we can see you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, hi everyone. Thank you, Ann and Thomas, for the work you've done for the book and clearly also for the book launch. And thank you very much, Robert Harriman and Aidan McGarry, for your comments. I found both of them very on point and insightful. Let me also add that it's a pleasure to see Robert Moynihan again after many years, if I'm not wrong. The last time we were in Tel Aviv when that kind of research that's been discussed today was taking shape. So I'd like to ask to offer a brief comment on a few concepts that have been used both in the book and today in the discussion, and to ask you or us together to briefly spend a few minutes to think more about them. I'm still somehow struggling with myself to strike a balance between the concepts of scarcity and abundance. They recur so often in the discourse on photography in digital age, and so on. But I still tend to consider them as two very strong dichotomies, very rigid dichotomy, sort of as if they were the pole of a continuum, the extreme poles of a continuum, where in fact most of the things we study are in the middle. So my problem is with the concept of scarcity and abundance, and some of you, Robert Harriman in particular, has already written quite a lot on this, but it's also related to the concept of resonance. So we clearly can think about resonance in relation to scarcity, to some icons, photos, tropes, themes that have been somehow institutionalized, that have gained traction over the years in different institutional contexts and so on. And so we can relate the concept of resonance to something that clearly has been already accepted into the collective or public memory. But at the same time, and resonance clearly is a very crucial keyword and concept in media study, from Michael Shatson to social movement and many other scholars in different areas. But at the same time, Robert, you were talking about the synesthesia of visual resonance. And it's something that I think has a lot to do, or has increasingly to do, with social media and digital media more widely. Because in the past, the concept of resonance could be more easily or more quickly referred to and related to topics of power in the more traditional sense. So this picture is resonant with another picture that we already know that has entered the collective memory or the public memory. Nowadays, I think that the affordance, the possibilities emerging online speaks much more closely to the idea of synesthesia, which is clearly another issue that has been studied in different ways in the field of visual culture, even Mitchell and many others. So I was wondering if we could think about a more nuanced definition or a more nuanced sort of typology of these concepts, in particular in relation to the idea of synesthesia of visual resonance. Because very quickly, synesthesia it seems to be more seems to be closer to the affective engagement of the protesters and the way in which they use visual media, while resonance seems to be more close to, closer to some more, say, traditional or even hegemonic forms of visual imagery from the past. So I was wondering if you could offer a few comments on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. I'm sort of looking at the time here, and we're sort of running out of our time. So, but this, of course, is a very important and interesting question. So I'd like to ask Aidan and to Robert for their thoughts, parting thoughts on these, the issue of synesthesia, resonance, or perhaps also going back to the original question of abundance and scarcity.
Well, the argument on abundance is in the last chapter of the public image, and I try to make a systematic argument there, and I'd rather just point to that rather than try to summarize it today. But the idea is, I mean, in part, this is an ethic that could be adopted in respect to both media and politics. It's a political theology, if you will. But so it's more than just marking information overload. But it is the case that claims about the excessiveness of the image world and the media environment are flat wrong. Claims that it morally anesthetizes us, for example. Claims that it just absolutely shatters our ability to focus on anything. I mean, there are a number of very strong claims in the old discourse that are just proved to be wrong. So there's that. Now, resonance, I mentioned it because it's there in the book, first of all. And, I think, well, they're using it. That's interesting. Also, it's an auditory term. So it's a metaphoric concept in this point when you're talking about visual phenomena, which is why I brought in the term synesthesia. So I think with both abundance and resonance, what's interesting about those terms is they're trying to capture something that's being missed with the vocabulary we had previously. And but I think they're valuable for that reason. At the same time, we shouldn't see them as mystifications, or if we do use them as mystifications, that's a mistake. So the idea is, what is abundance that's not just some, aura or something? What is resonance? It's obviously metaphoric, so it's trying to capture something about visuality that we can't express. And we do this all the time, of course. We talk about the colors of music, for example. So these cross-media metaphors can be important means for marking, but they aren't necessarily yet explanations of what's happening.
Okay.
So I would say we need to lean into abundance. We need to lean into resonance to try capture what we've been currently missing.
Okay. Thank you. Aidan, would you like to follow up on that?
No, I defer to Robert on that one. I agree with what he said. I can't add anything. So
yeah, well, maybe we go from visuality into synesthesia as a sort of as we move forward. unfortunately, I think we're going to have to stop here. We've reached our time, but I hope we've given you a bit of a sense of what the book is about. And thank you so much again to Robert Harriman and Aidan McGarry for your very helpful and thoughtful comments. Hopefully these will also be appetizers to for readers to again get hold of, if not the material book, at least the open access PDF, to see for yourselves what we have done with these various concepts, and perhaps to think along with how we could move on from here. So thank you all for being with us, and thank you again to our commentators. And I wish you all a lovely evening and future pleasures in reading our book. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. And just to a final note, the book is in the chat, so the link to the open access thing. So
okay,
yeah, I will leave it open. So thank you very much and see you later. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.